From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Donald Trump talks taxes and tariffs, among other issues, in a wide-ranging interview with Bloomberg, the former president defending his economic proposals with 3 weeks to the election. We'll break down what he said with economist Michael Linden from the Washington Center for Equitable Growth.
And we'll dig deeper into Donald Trump's tax proposals and his plans for offsetting cuts with Kimberly Clausing, tax law and policy professor at UCLA.
And with the economy topping most voters' lists of priorities this election, we'll focus on how economic messaging from both the Trump and Harris campaigns is landing in the closing weeks of this race. Thanks for being with us here on the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kaylee, we are now 3 weeks out from this election, a pretty important conversation today to help voters and the markets make up their minds.
Absolutely. Focused exclusively on Donald Trump's proposed economic policies, a more than hour-long conversation between the former president and Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, John Micklethwait. Here's a taste of how it went.
We're all about growth. We're going to bring companies back to our country. To me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff, and it's my favorite word. It needs a public relations firm. I had a very good relationship with President Xi, and a very good relationship with Putin, and a very good relationship with Kim Jong-un.
You worry about that?
The dollar is so secure. Your reserve currency is the strongest it'll ever be. I think that if you're a very good president with good sense, you should be able to at least talk to them. I don't say make the decision at all. Take a look at Detroit. Take a look at our cities. We're a developing nation. We have to develop more than they do. We're way behind them. You take a look at what's happened to our cities.
They went for about an hour. And joining us now, Bloomberg's Wendy, Benjaminson, and Gregory Korte. It's great to have both of you with us. Gregory, I'm going to start with you here today. We've heard dose by dose the elements of Donald Trump's economic policy proposals. Today, we kind of saw the whole mosaic put together. Did he make news? Did we learn anything new?
Look, this was a compilation of some of Trump's greatest hits, I think, as you were suggesting. He sort of went into rally mode at times. But as I think you're saying, like this was the first time that we really had it all packaged into one very succinct sort of hour-long event where we could put some of these ideas side by side. And I think what we learned was that Trump's proposal to just about the solution to just about any economic problem is tariffs. Whether you're talking about the trade deficit or the budget deficit or unemployment or inflation, Trump thinks that that tariffs would be a solution to all of these. Now, the tension in this interview was that that's not a very mainstream economic view. But Trump continued to push back and make his case. It felt a lot like 2016, which was a campaign very much based on this idea that the rest of the world is eating our lunch when it comes to trade, and we need to fight back. And this is, I think, it's 2016 exponentially larger.
Well, and 3 weeks out from an election, Wendy, it is a question of whether what economists believe really matters, or more so just what voters actually will believe, which raises the question of what audience Donald Trump was primarily speaking to today.
Absolutely. I'm not sure how much of Trump's base voters were tuned in, but the room seemed to be filled with business people who, at least partly filled with business people who largely agreed with him. And our poll, other polls consistently show the economy as the top issue, and that voters trust Donald Trump more on the economy than they do on other issues, especially those that are more people-oriented, that are more about what Kamala Harris calls the caring economy. But on economic issues like bringing manufacturing back to the United States, and people will believe Trump that tariffs work, despite the fact that most economists don't.
Well, it's interesting because Gregory mentions this felt a little bit like 2016, but those were relatively new ideas, at least for the current electorate when Donald Trump was talking about it then. We have 4 years to look back on. And we see that Joe Biden kept those tariffs in place.
He did.
Is that not a message in itself?
It is a bit of a message in itself. Trump wants to turbo those tariffs, of course, and make them much brought it much longer. It's also the only revenue enhancer he ever mentions. You know, the other way is that the Democrats get around this is by raising taxes on rich people, by, you know, raising the corporate rate, but things like that to bring in more money. Donald Trump is talking about cutting taxes for corporations, you know, lowering taxes for billionaires, and a litany of tax cuts every time one pops into his head. You know, the deductibility of a car loan or these other tax cuts he's doing. The only thing that will bring in money to make up for those tax cuts, if any of them get through, is his tariffs idea.
Well, and tariffs, of course, one component in which we see economic policy and geopolitical considerations coming into play here. And there was a lot of conversation on geopolitics in this interview, including when Trump was asked about his relationship with Vladimir Putin and whether he has spoken to him since leaving the White House. This was his answer.
Well, I don't comment on that, but I will tell you that if I did, it's a smart thing. If I'm friendly with people, if I have a relationship with people, that's a good thing, not a bad thing, in terms of a country. He's got 2,000 nuclear weapons, and so do we. China has a lot less, but they'll catch us within 5 years.
So it would have been smart for him to talk to Putin. Gregory, no confirmation as to whether or not he really did. But as we heard at the beginning of the show here, it's not just Putin, also touting his relationships with Xi and Kim Jong-un. Kamala Harris has focused on that kind of language, saying that Donald Trump wants to be friends with dictators who flatter him. Again, similar to what I just asked Wendy, does it matter to voters?
Look, I mean, there's two different audiences for this. One is obviously the voters, and we're very used to thinking about these things in sort of horse race terms. We think of politicians and presidential candidates as transactional. The only reason why he would ever answer a question is to try to win votes. But it's also, look, we need to know what to expect if either of these two candidates gets elected. And I think we know a little bit about both of them, right? One's been vice president for almost 4 years. The other was president for 4 years. We know how Trump dealt with Putin and Xi and Kim Jong-un during his presidency. And, you know, the thing about this world is that dictators tend to stick around for a long time. And so Trump, even after taking 4 years off, will be dealing with some of the same cast of characters. On the other side, he brought up Macron today as well. So he does have relationships with a lot of these world leaders, some of them a little bit more filled with a little bit of tension than others.
You mentioned, I think, importantly, who was in the room today. You got a lot of laugh lines, a lot of applause lines. Did anything change today in this construct that Wall Street is more comfortable with a Trump 2.0 than someone they know less about named Kamala Harris?
Right. I don't think so. And I do think that we're at a point in the election where they've sort of honed their messages. And Trump is continuing to talk about the economy and immigration, the economy and immigration. And the Harris campaign seems to be focused in these last 3 weeks on turnout, because what she's talking about mostly is, isn't Trump awful? That's what her message has been. She's put out some policy positions, but she's not really hammering them home. And you know, I think most people in this country have a formed opinion about Donald Trump. They either think he's awful or they don't. And I'm not sure whether that message is enough in this razor-thin election to get those 7 swing states that she needs so badly.
Well, in one of them, Georgia, voting began today, a record turnout for early voting of more than 250,000, which brings us to this point, Gregory. We just have a minute left here, but this election is already underway. It's not just about November 5th.
Yeah, and the other question that Trump was asked today by our editor-in-chief, John Micklethwait, was which state are you paying most attention to on election night? That's a question that a lot of politicians would not answer because it's like picking among your children, right? But he said Pennsylvania. And, of course, that's the state that has it's the biggest electoral prize, 19 electoral votes. It's also one of the closest, and it's among the most hard fought if you just look at how much is being the millions and millions that are being spent on ads there. It may well come down to Pennsylvania as the tipping point state.
And it may well, as we saw in 2020, take us several days to figure out who actually won Pennsylvania. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson and Gregory Korte, thank you so much. Now coming up, we'll take a closer look at Donald Trump's proposed economic policies with Michael Linden, Senior Policy Fellow at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth and Executive Associate Director at the White House Office of Budget Management under the Biden administration. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
think it's the greatest job in government. You show up to the office once a month and you say, let's see, flip a coin. And everybody talks about you like you're a god. Oh, what will he do? I think that if you're a very good president with good sense, you should be able to at least talk to him. I don't say make the decision at all.
Former President Donald Trump earlier today on the influence the president should have on the Federal Reserve as part of a wide-ranging conversation with Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, John Micklethwait, about his economic proposals. For more analysis here on Bloomberg TV and radio, joining us now is Michael Linden. He is Senior Policy Fellow at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth and former Executive Associate Director at the White House Office of Management and Budget under the Biden administration. Michael, thanks so much for being here. We do want to talk to you about the fiscal policy proposals Donald Trump has put forward, but monetary policy plays an important role in this economy, too. What would it really mean if the president played a more direct role in it?
Well, I think there's been some analysis of this, and what the bottom line is when you take away some of the independence of the Federal Reserve, you end up with worse outcomes. That's just the sort of long and the short of it. Some people have found higher prices or slower growth. Ultimately, one of the hallmarks of the American economy, one of the strengths of the American economy has been the separation of fiscal policy and monetary policy and the independence of the Federal Reserve. And that gives a certain amount of certainty to the business community, to workers, to families. And I think that would be a very dangerous thing to take away from.
We talked to Scott Bessent about this the other day right here at this table, Key Square Group, close economic advisor to Donald Trump. He said he's just talking. Everybody gets a chance to talk. Elizabeth Warren gets to say what she wants about interest rates. Why would the president be any different?
Donald Trump is running for president. Elizabeth Warren is not. And there is a responsibility that comes with that task. Then that kind of erratic approach to economic policy making, I think, flows throughout all of what you saw today, actually, in the interview. A little bit all over the place. He would say one thing and then talk about something else that was a little bit scattered. Yeah. And honestly, at the end of the day, what you really want is that certainty that the president is not going to interfere with monetary policy. That is going to create more crises, more uncertainty that is just not good for the economy.
So if we're dealing in things that are certain here, could you say, Michael, to Wall Street and to those that are paying attention to economic matters, that it is a certainty that no matter who wins this election, the deficit is likely to go up, potentially as a result, inflation is likely to be more persistent?
I actually don't think that's a certainty. I think you have two very different approaches to thinking about fiscal policy in the budgets. I think you have one approach with Donald Trump who says, let's cut taxes for rich people, for corporations. Let's double down on those same failed tax cuts that he did in the first term. That's something we can look at and see how those went. But then, of course, as you know, he's thrown out tax cut over tax cut over tax cut over and over again. Mm-hmm. Partially offset by higher taxes, essentially, on middle-class families through tariffs. That's who would pay the tariffs.
And growth, he suggests.
He says growth, but of course that's always what people who say, let's give tax cuts to the people at the top, it'll trickle down to everybody else. That never really happens. On the other hand, you do have Kamala Harris, who has said she's going to reduce the deficit, and she does have a plausible path towards that by raising taxes on rich people and corporations. The specifics of that are going to matter, no question. There's a range of possible outcomes, but she has a plausible path toward reducing the deficit, and nobody thinks that Donald Trump has a plausible path towards that.
To reducing the deficit, even as the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which John Micklethwait presented Donald Trump with his own numbers, I think they were closer to $3 trillion added to the deficit under Kamala Harris's plan. Are we in a world where it's lesser of two evils then?
No, I think, and that analysis also had a scenario where it's paid for, everything she does is paid for, and there was no such scenario for Donald Trump. And obviously, we don't know exactly how these policies will play out, but if you zoom way out and just ask yourself, which of these two candidates has a plausible set of policies that will actually raise revenue, which is the fundamental challenge we have in the federal budget? Kamala Harris does have that, from raising the corporate tax rate, raising taxes on the top rate on individuals. Donald Trump's plan will dramatically reduce taxes on people at the top, costing trillions of dollars over the next 10 years. Tariffs might offset a little bit of that, but again, who's paying those tariffs? It's middle-class families, it's low-income families. That's not a great economic approach for growth.
Something else that Donald Trump was asked about today is the dollar as the world's reserve currency. He contends that none of his policies would put that at risk. He suggested if you want to turn into a third world country, lose your status as a reserve currency. What do you think realistically does happen with the dollar if these proposals come to fruition?
I think it's interesting that he referenced the third world in this particular case, because one of the hallmarks of the American economy and the strength of the American economy is that we don't do crony capitalism, or we try very hard not to, right? We should have rules of the road that everybody follows, and everybody knows those rules, and then the best business wins. They outcompete each other. But part of Donald Trump's plan is these very high tariffs and then exceptions. You heard him talk about this today in the interview, that he would give exceptions to people who asked for them. So the people who know him, who are close to him, who have influence with him, would get some of those exceptions. I think the quickest way to undermine the strength of the American economy is to start having, whoever gets to be closest, whoever's nicest to Donald Trump gets the special arrangement. And you heard him talk about this today. He likes Elon Musk, but he doesn't like Google because Google was mean to him. That's not a great way to make economic policy.
Didn't have great things to say about EVs, though, even if he likes Elon Musk.
Mr. Musk thought about that.
Talk to us about this perception on Wall Street, then, that Donald Trump would be friendlier to investors. Is it as simple as a lower corporate tax rate, or is it more complicated than that? He wants to give a spoonful of sugar. Kamala Harris wants Wall Street to eat its vegetables.
Look, I think it is hard for Wall Street to look at these two candidates, one who is saying, let's raise corporate taxes, let's raise taxes on investment income, and another who's saying, let's cut taxes for those very same things. They like the lower taxes. They've always liked the lower taxes. But what I would say to them is, at the end of the day, what really drives business is customers. Customers drive business. And which of these two candidates has a plan to grow the middle class, which is where the American customer base is? The engine of economic prosperity is everyday workers, everyday customers. And ultimately, giving tax cuts directed at those folks is really where the business growth will come from.
Well, and not all those customers and workers you're referring to actually have legal status in this country. Immigration is something else that coalesces with the economy here, as Donald Trump is advocating for mass deportation potentially of millions of people. What will the actual economic effect of that be immediately, potentially before any kind of reform to the legal immigration system can get through?
I think it's a great question, and I think to zoom way out and think about how Donald Trump manages crises, that's really what you're asking, is how is the chief executive of this country going to manage through difficult things? And we've seen what happens when Donald Trump tries to manage through difficult things with COVID, and even more recently in the last few weeks with these hurricanes, in creating misinformation and stoking fear. That is not a recipe for calm, useful, productive economic stewardship. I think mass deportation fits in that same bucket. Now, listen, we can have a conversation about better immigration policy, and I think the vice president has been very clear that she wants a safe and secure border. But Donald Trump was president for 4 years, and he says he wants a safe and secure border. He wants people to come here legally, but he didn't do a single thing to improve the system to allow people to come here legally. And so that is really a lot of just words from him.
Let's talk about that more when you come back. Michael, it's great to have you. Michael Linden, Senior Policy Fellow, the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. We thank you for the insights. Coming up, Donald Trump says he would squash the deal to sell U.S. steel if he becomes president. And it hasn't gone through yet. Market reaction to that and much more from what we heard from the former president today on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's been a tough business. It was a great business many years ago, and I would not let U.S. steel be sold to Japanese, by the way. It's psychologically, I think it would be...
That's the Nippon steel, unless you... No.
Yeah, I wouldn't I wouldn't let it be sold. But I would, I would stop it if it hasn't been completed by the time I'm president.
Donald Trump earlier today on U.S. Steel. The stock initially dipped on those comments before ending the day with a gain. Joining us now with more at the market reaction to his interview with Bloomberg is our very own Emily Graffeo in New York. So, Emily, it was an hour-long conversation. What did we see in the aftermath?
Well, we saw a lot of volatility, particularly in U.S. Steel. It was kind of confusing that the stock did end up higher by about 1.6% after initially dropping almost 1% on that messaging from Trump. But I will note that his sentiment has kind of been something that U.S. lawmakers from both sides of the political aisle have been saying for months now, that they've criticized this purchase of U.S. steel by Japanese steelmaker Nippon Steel. So it wasn't too surprising to see Trump come out and kind of say that today. We also saw a number of other market movements, particularly in emerging market currencies. I'm looking at the peso weakening against the dollar, but a wider basket really of EM currencies falling after Trump doubled down on his proposals to impose tariffs as a way to draw manufacturing into the U.S. And then DJT. It's hard to make sense of moves sometimes in this stock because it's particularly seen on social media as somewhat of a meme stock, but this is shares of Trump media. They slid as much as 12% to the downside today, but at one point they had gained as much as 13%. If that gives you a little sense of the volatility here, I guess we can make a little bit of a message here from investors saying that they maybe did not completely like the interview because oftentimes that stock is kind of a sentiment for how investors and maybe meme investors are thinking about Donald Trump. But it really moved around a lot today. So.
Well, not a great look across the board here. Goldman Sachs down, United Health after beating earnings targets. Emily, how much of this just has to do with the fact that we set another all-time high yesterday?
Yeah, I mean, the bar is really high right now for stocks, and we did see the S&P 500 come off that high, but a lot of it was earnings related. So far, the bank earnings have been pretty good, but in the chip space, we've seen a lot of weakness. Also, when you look beyond the U.S. today, news out of Dutch chip machinery maker ASML posted disappointing earnings. Their guidance for 2025 had to be lowered, and then their current metrics on some key earnings statistics for the current quarter also missed estimates. So we saw that stock plunging the most in 26 years. And then we also saw weakness in NVIDIA because there was news that U.S. officials have discussed capping sales of their advanced AI chips from the company to other countries. And we know the chip makers, all those AI names really lead the market. So that was kind of bringing the weakness in the afternoon trading session.
Yeah, and to think we're just getting started with reporting season. Bloomberg's Emily Graffeo, thank you so much for walking us through the markets today, Emily. We'll have a lot more coming up on the interview today with a closer look at Donald Trump's proposed tax policy. A conversation ahead with UCLA's Kimberly Clausing, who worked at the Treasury Department under the Biden administration, as we unpack an important conversation and possibly the last comprehensive interview about the economy that Donald Trump will conduct this election season. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We're all about growth. We're going to bring companies back to our country. We're going to lower taxes still further for companies that are going to make their product in the USA. We're going to protect those companies with strong tariffs because I'm a believer in tariffs.
Donald Trump speaking with Bloomberg earlier today in partnership with the Economic Club of Chicago, our editor-in-chief John Micklethwait holding forth with a series of questions focused on his economic policy proposals, including, yes, taxes and tariffs. Can't have one without the other after listening to Donald Trump today. And joining us to help unpack some of this now is Kimberly Clausing, tax law and policy professor at UCLA, former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Analysis with the Treasury Department in the Biden administration. Kimberly, welcome. It's great to have you on Bloomberg TV and radio. This does seem to be the same story for Donald Trump when you're talking about tax proposals, in his case, a series of tax cuts on top of making the Trump tax cuts permanent, a series of deductions, I should say, paid for in part by higher tariffs. Do you have the math that works that out?
Unfortunately, the math doesn't quite work out. If you look at the take of tariffs, which I object to for a host of reasons, I think they would harm the economy. But if you just look at the simple calculation of how much would the tariffs he has suggested bring in, it falls much short of what you would need to pay for the long list of tax cuts he's suggested. And I think for this reason, the Center for Responsible Federal Budget, which is a nonpartisan centrist creates many more deficits than the Kamala Harris plan would, more than twice as much in the median estimates.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we consider here that we do have a guide of history as well, we have seen a Trump administration before that included tax cuts and included the placement on tariffs on a number of Chinese goods that largely have stayed intact throughout this administration. The argument you will hear from Donald Trump and those close to him, those who are in favor of his ideas, is that we didn't get to see that fully realized in the first administration because of COVID. We could have grown our way out of those tax cuts had the pandemic not intervened. To what extent is that, at least in some part, true?
If you look at the tax cuts from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the record is extremely clear. The economy that he inherited when he started his administration was a strong economy. They added a bunch of tax cuts. Revenues went down substantially, both individual income tax revenues and corporate tax revenues. And there have been a host of very careful studies that have documented that tight link between the reductions in the tax rates and the reduction in revenue. So any growth that materialized from this was not only not visible in the big macro aggregates. If you looked at investment trends, wage trends, and growth trends, you couldn't pick out the year that the tax cut happened if you were looking at this in a dispassionate way. But they certainly didn't generate enough growth to pay for itself, as some of the proponents at the time argued. But most economists throughout the political spectrum would reject that fact now. It really doesn't seem like these tax cuts pay for themselves, and you can't really see a big break in the big macro aggregates.
Well, let's stick with the math then for a moment, Kimberly. What would be the impact of allowing the Trump-era tax cuts to expire? Republicans say it would equal the biggest tax hike in modern history.
I think it would be the biggest tax hike on the rich. If you look at how much they gained from those tax cuts, the typical household at the very top gained quite a bit. But I think the median American household, their tax cut was only a few $100s a year, right? So if you look at a few $100s a year spread out across 24 pay periods, it's not a super large tax cut that typical households got. And the lower in the income distribution you were, the lower the tax cut. I think it was about $70 for those in the bottom quintile for an entire year. So undoing that would be noticeable. And I don't think, people want to see their taxes go up. I'm not trying to say that this wouldn't be noticeable, but I don't think it would be very large for a lot of Americans. And I think another way you can tell is when you go back to the enactment of that legislation and you polled Americans, did you receive a tax cut? Half of them didn't even notice it was happening. There was very little salience to taxes going down at the time. So it's possible that if Congress can't agree on extending this, that it wouldn't be a very big deal for a lot of households. I hope that they will come up with some sort of agreement that will balance the fiscal needs of this country with sound tax improvements that can, dampen the hit to those who would be more vulnerable to a tax increase. But I don't think it would be a disaster if taxes went up a bit.
Well, Kamala Harris is arguing that an effective tax on the consumer would go up if the tariffs Donald Trump is proposing would go into place. So just to return to that idea that we began with, can you just walk us through how the transaction works, knowing your experience at the Treasury Department, when a tariff is levied on a good coming in from any foreign country? In this example, let's use China. Is China paying that, or is the importer paying that? And what usually happens next?
Yeah, so the importer pays the tariffs. That's just a fact of the world, is that the importer is the one who's assigned the burden of remitting that tax. The second question that I think is the more interesting one is who is burdened by the tax. And we have a lot of studies of the Trump tariffs at this point, almost a dozen really high-quality economic studies that have looked at that episode, and they found that U.S. consumers of imports and buyers of imports bared nearly 100% of the burden of those tariffs. It's theoretically possible that foreigners could respond to tariffs by lowering the prices they charged Americans, but we don't see that in that instance, and there isn't a strong reason to suspect that they would. At the border, the importer pays the tariff, and the evidence indicates the consumers pay the tariffs. So work that I've done with Mary Lovely and others indicates that for the typical American household, the Trump tariff proposals are going to cost cost about $2,600 in terms of additional cost to the imported goods that they consume. And that's before you even get to the fact that domestic goods that are made here in the United States that compete with imports, those will also become more expensive, not just because they compete with imports, but also because they embody, in many instances, imported intermediate goods. So U.S. households will get hit with a lot of costs, even beyond those that I've estimated.
What did you learn today that was new, Kimberly, or is this the same Donald Trump when it comes to the economy who was in office 4 years ago?
I think this Donald Trump seems more extreme than the one we saw 4 years ago. He seems to have a much more carte blanche approach to tariffs, where he just wants to apply them to everybody. At times, what he was saying today suggested that he wanted to create really autarky in the United States, which is a word we use to describe completely closed, no trade economy. And if you think about the harm that that would do, I think it would be very large, easily could lead to a recession, if not a depression, in the United States, and would alienate us from all of our allies and partners abroad at the same time. At one point in the interview, he said, 10%, 20% might not be high enough because the imports will still come in. Why don't we go to 50%? And that's really sounding like a candidate who doesn't want to collect revenue from tariffs, but what he really wants to do is just plain stop trade. And I think that would be very dangerous for the U.S. economy and for our trading partners, and frankly, for the world economy as a whole.
All right, Kimberly Clausing, tax law and policy professor at UCLA. Thank you for joining us. Coming up, we'll take a closer look at the political reaction to Donald Trump's economic policies with our political panel. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Would you appoint a CEO who was 78? You didn't give you a medical.
I would. Depends on. I've met people like Biden, who's in bad shape. I wouldn't appoint him. He's 81 or 82.
Strangely, you didn't bring this up but you were running against Joe Biden.
No, I never attacked him for his age. In fact, I used to defend him on his age. I attacked him for his lack of competence.
The age issue rears its ugly head again in the conversation between Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, John Micklethwait, and yes, Donald Trump. We brought it to you live, and we now assemble our political panel to gauge the impact. Matt Gorman is with us, Executive Vice President at Targeted Victory, Republican strategist, alongside Kristen Hahn, partner at Rock Solutions, Democratic strategist. Great to have you both here. This was quite a conversation, lasted the better part of an hour. And I have to start with you on this one, Matt. I thought I did hear a couple things about Joe Biden's age when he was still in the race, didn't you?
Yeah, it was mental acuity, age. That's why I was kind of laughing when Kamala wanted to talk about releasing Trump's medical issues, because I don't think they really wanted to go down that road about what they knew and when they knew it about Joe Biden's medical issues.
Have they turned the tables on this issue?
Not at all, because that's also not a message. But look, I think, certainly Joe Biden is going to be still kind of present in this race. Obviously, you hear some tension between the Harris campaign and the Biden White House still. He does loom large in this race regardless.
But he is not running. Donald Trump is, Kristen. And we've heard a lot of these ideas we heard today from Donald Trump throughout the course of what his lengthy campaign has been. Would an undecided voter, yet to make up their mind with 3 weeks to go, have been moved potentially by what we heard from him in Chicago today?
I don't think so. I think that this was probably one of his better performances. So if people were looking for, reassurances that he's not completely lost it, maybe that's something, that did that for him. But I don't think, people who are going to be with Donald Trump are already there. And I don't think this, moved the needle all that much.
Well, there's a lot of talk about who the audience was today. Was it Wall Street? Was it people in their living rooms? Was it people in swing states? Maybe one called Michigan? Donald Trump did refer to them, or at least the city of Detroit, as part of the conversation. Let's listen.
Not one president, think of it, not one president charged China anything. They said, they are a third world nation, they are developing. Well, we're a developing nation too. Take a look at Detroit. Take a look at our cities. We're a developing nation. We have to develop more than they do. We're way behind them. You take a look at what's happened to our cities.
Okay, so I don't know if this is a propensity to criticize cities that he's visiting. We went through this in Milwaukee. Or are you going to tell me that he knows that the base loves this, that he's not speaking to voters in inner cities?
I mean, he's speaking to the same audience here. He's one note. He plays the hits, whether you're at a rally or you're at the Bloomberg Economic Forum. Okay. So I think this was what it was, more than anything else. And you're right. I think he was speaking to the fact of what has, essentially two generations at least of Democratic leadership in the city brought it. But yeah, no, I think that's something I would expect to hear the same thing at a rally this weekend if he has one.
Well, he is supposed to be back in Detroit on Friday, come to think of it. He's actually going to be in Georgia before that, though, doing a town hall with Fox, specifically with an entirely female audience. It's supposed to be focused on women's issues, knowing that he does have more credibility with voters on the economy, which he discussed today. That is something that Harris is winning on right now, is women's issues. So what does he need to do in that event?
He needs to couch the terms of this election in the economic terms. You heard this also J.D. Vance on the Sunday shows over the weekend talking about how women care about inflation, how it hits them just as hard as it hits men. And you hear those sorts of transitions. That also in the J.D. Vance debate strategy, disarming some of those critiques, that was what he was also going for when dealing with Tim Walz and that sort of thing. Yeah. Look, they're very acute on what the gender gap is. A lot has been talked about our problems with women. Obviously, Kamala Harris and men, too, there's a gender gap on their side. So I think you're exactly right. Expect to hear those sorts of things at this town hall with Fox and a lot of economic terms.
You've been doing this for a minute. What do you make of this 11th hour play by both campaigns to just be right on the nose? You've got a problem with a certain demographic. We'll go hold a town hall just with those people on Thursday night. You've got another point of weakness. We'll go and we'll have a special radio show. Right now, Kamala Harris is talking to Charlamagne Lagarde. She knows exactly who she's speaking to and why. We've splintered this down to the most narrow level, haven't we?
I mean, yeah, no, the all pretense is off here. We're going exactly for who we're trying to get. And look, I mean, I'll be honest, we've talked about the Republican problems with women and our gender gap for years. Obviously, in the Trump era, Roe, the overturn of that really crystallized in a very unique way after 22. And I think the male issues with the Republican Party, those seem to, Democratic Party, have bubbled up recently for them. But it's been a cultural phenomenon in the making for a couple of years now. And when I saw, for example, last night, Reuters reported that maybe Joe Rogan and Kamala Harris are in talks for an interview, my first thought was, good God, those polls must be atrocious, because I think the NBC News poll that came out over the weekend was the gender gap with Democrats and men was even larger, 16 points, versus the Republican one with women, 15 points. So really what this election is going to come down to is who can do better, shrink their own gender gap. That's going to be the story of this election.
Well, so as we consider, as you suggest, the polls must be terrible. We do feel like there is a different sense this week about the polls and the way in which this race was trending. Everybody seemingly woke up at the start of the week and thought, perhaps this is a different story than the one we've been telling since Kamala Harris entered the race. What exactly do you see happening here? Was it just it took off like a rocket ship, so stasis feels like decline? Or do you think it really is decline?
Kamala Harris did really well around convening events, right? When she got into the race, had a bump. Convention, bump. Debate, bump. There is nothing left. There is no convening event, right? So you're at the mercy and the vacuum of external events. And every time when that shine is worn off, you've seen a little bit of decline in numbers. But there's always, up until now, been that next thing that she could point to. I think the challenge for her now is how does she get back on offense? One thing I would expect, I wouldn't be surprised if you hear it, watch for her on this Fox News interview tomorrow night. I wouldn't be surprised if she goes and challenges Trump suddenly to a Fox debate. She's kept it at arm's length for a long time. Does she change her tune? Does she try and get that one convening event between now and election day?
Without that event, you sit in the swing states the next 3 weeks. How do you use your time? The ad time's reserved. What do you do with your money?
This moment reminds me so much of early July, when the Biden team obviously had a lot of really negative momentum. They were in the middle of the post-debate kind of doldrums, and they were practically begging Trump to come out and distract and begging Trump to insert himself in a negative way where they can go on offense. I think what you're seeing here with the medical records trolling, the trolling about not doing interviews up until today with mainstream press, is a way for Democrats to try and troll Trump into inserting himself in a negative way.
All right, Matt Gorman is sticking with us. Coming up, we'll talk more about Kamala Harris and her sit-down with Charlamagne Lagarde, which is happening right now ahead of that Fox interview tomorrow. More ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
the biggest allegations against you is that you targeted and locked up thousands of black men in San Francisco for weed. Some say you did it to boost your career. Some say you did it out of pure hate for black men. Please tell us the facts. What's the facts of that situation?
It's just simply not true. And what public defenders who are around those days will tell you, I was the most progressive prosecutor in California on marijuana cases and would not send people to jail for simple possession of weed.
That was Kamala Harris during her audio town hall with Charlamagne tha God, which is still underway at this hour. So back with us for more is Matt Gorman, Republican strategist with Targeted Victory. So, Matt, we have been having a lot of conversations when we consider the demographic makeup, and we just talked about the gender gap. There is racial questions to consider here as well. Kamala Harris is not polling as well with black men and black voters in general as Joe Biden was in 2020. I spoke with someone who runs the Collective PAC last week, focused on getting black voters out and getting black candidates elected to office. And he said, he's a Democrat, the Republican Party has done a good job of attracting black men. How tenuous is that tie? Or do you think the people who have started to gravitate toward Donald Trump might stay there?
It takes a lot more work to get low propensity voters out, and black males kind of qualify in that low propensity group where they're not voting in every midterm election. They're not voting in, say, their local elections normally. They might come out maybe for a presidential if it's the right candidate. So there a lot more work has to go in to invest in to get that. So that is number one. So when you see some of these, for example, Georgia had its first day of early voting, I believe it was yesterday.
More than 250,000 people showed up.
That tells me, I bet you some of those are low propensity voters, black men that we want. Same with numbers when you see coming out of Pennsylvania, right? It's likely to be some folks in that crowd. That is what I'm seeing. That's what encourages me.
Glad to say we can add the voice of Jeannie Sheehan Zaino to this conversation, Bloomberg politics contributor and political science professor at Iona University. Jeannie, welcome back. You were with us for the address today. Now, Kamala Harris, as Kayleigh just mentioned, is in the throes of an audio town hall with Charlamagne tha God. He was just talking to her about what was considered a virtue by this campaign, her record as a prosecutor in California. When it comes to issues like legalizing cannabis, for instance, she's facing difficult questions on having, quote unquote, locked up young black men for that offense in the past. How does she balance this?
Yeah, I mean, this has been the challenge for Kamala Harris going back a ways, where you have people who look at her as a prosecutor and they find that that is problematic for them, particularly on the far left. And so she's going to have to balance that in this quest to try to ensure that she gets the black vote up to what were Joe Biden's really good numbers in 2020. And so we knew there were going to be tough questions about her as a prosecutor. I think it's also critically important for her to address the issue of the economy with these folks, because like everybody, that is the number one concern. And so I would have cautioned her to move forward as much as possible and pivot back to the economy.
Well, so Jeannie, with 3 weeks here on the calendar, does she need to schedule an interview like the one Donald Trump took part in today? She has been invited by Bloomberg.
She absolutely does. The interview today with Donald Trump was, I think, one of the best I've ever seen, a one-on-one interview where you have tough questions and he's given the time to answer those. And I would love to see Kamala Harris do the same thing, particularly on the issue of the economy, because this is what Gallup tells us. 9 out of 10 voters think is the most significant issue as they walk into the polling booth, or as we know, are already voting these last few days. And so, yes, she should sit down for exactly those kinds of questions.
You wonder what kind of a response she would get in that room where we heard a lot of laughter and applause today for Donald Trump, a friendly environment. Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, great to have you back, Jeannie. And Matt Gorman, thank you for a smart conversation on an important day here on the trail. We'll, of course, be following not only Kamala Harris in this conversation underway, the audio town hall that's taking place on the radio, but tomorrow as well on Fox. And in the meantime, check out the Washington Edition newsletter. A lot more on today's interview on the terminal and online.
And, of course, you can find Joe and I back here tomorrow. We'll see you at 1 p.m. Eastern Time and 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg TV and radio.